Our speaker tonight is Dr. Andrea Weeks, and I've seen several of you talking to her earlier and probably putting more thoughts in her head and more questions in her head. This lady comes out here and ends up going home with more questions and more and more. Andrea is an associate professor of biology at George Mason University, and she's the director of the Ted R. Bradley Herbarium at Mason. I didn't even know that existed. She's a native of Maryland, and she's lived in Virginia and taught there and taught at Mason since 2005. And I learned about Andrea and her subject of Lena Artz when I went to a Belle Grove presentation, because Lena was a friend of Francis Hunnewell, the last private owner of Belle Grove, and they hiked and tramped over the Massanutten Mountain and collected things together. And since then, I went to her presentation in Fort Valley, and then she came to our Heritage Day in April, which was in Newmarket, and wowed people there with her story. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about it tonight. And you know how you keep coming up with these little connections. Well, Bonnie just told me that she remembers Frances Hoover, who was her good friend. Frances was quite a gardener, and so was her mother, I think. That Frances Hoover was a really good friend of Lena Artz and talked about her quite a bit. Well, I live in Frances Hoover's house. So, not that I know anything, I don't have any particular information, but it's pretty cool to think, golly, she might have come there sometime. I don't know. But Andrea, we're looking forward to it.
So I'm really happy to talk to you tonight about Lena Artz. This is a woman who I didn't know anything about 4 years ago, and every time I talk to more people, I learn something new. And so I want to share with you the story to date. I'm always learning new things, but I think I have the arc of her life, but there's still more to learn. So this image that I show you here is a south view from the end of Short Mountain. So this is up on the knob in Mount Jackson, which you can see from I-81. And this was a stomping ground of Lena Artz that I returned to. So we all know where we are, but I always show this image to other people who are not from the Massanuttons, just to put some names on some places. Because the story of Lena Artz is very much a story about a place as much as it is about a person. And so the Massanuttons were where she worked, and she also spent a lot of time in Fort Valley, which of course is that valley in the center part of the mountains. So this is a picture of Lena Artz, and it's actually the way I learned of her. She is a person who was pictured in the flora of Virginia. And that's how I knew her name. She's the only woman pictured by herself, and it mentions her dedication to the flora of the Massanuttons. So I'm just going to pass this around just so you can get a heft of this. So my goal today is to tell you about how I stumbled upon her and took this on as a research project, and then tell you who she was. And then I want to wrap up talking about, I think, why her legacy matters today. And that continues to grow. So as Barbara mentioned, I'm a professor at George Mason University, and I also curate a research collection of plants, and that is called a herbarium. And this is an image of a herbarium, not at Mason, but one that looks very similar to ours. And you can see it's a room filled with cabinets, and in those cabinets are dried, pressed specimens of plants. And they are used by researchers, and I have one here with me today, so you can sort of get a sense of what they look like. They've got a real plant that has been pressed and affixed using archival materials, and a label saying where it was collected. So I'm going to also pass this around. So I was involved in a project to adopt the herbarium from Lord Fairfax Community College, which is now known as Laurel Ridge. And we packed up the 13,000 specimens that were held at this college, and we moved them to George Mason University, where they were going to, well, and where they are being held, added to our collection. And we were really excited to receive this collection because the northwestern corner of Virginia is actually not well collected, which is sort of surprising. And we knew that this collection was going to be really valuable because it densely sampled this area. And subsequent to that, we found a number of state and regional records. So this is just a herbarium specimen of northern lady fern, which we didn't know grew in Virginia, but now we do because we found a specimen of it in this collection. And the National Science Foundation awarded us support to my university to curate the collection, to repair it, and just to make it useful. As part of this, I got to hire a graduate research assistant, and he is pictured here, young man. His name is Matthew Sheik. And for his project, he was going to be helping me in the herbarium, doing this sort of administrative work. But for his thesis project, he selected to do a flora of Shenandoah River State Park. That is just over the hills in Bentonville. It's this image, which is a little bit blurry here. It shows you the park. It's along the South Fork of the Shenandoah River. And I knew this was going to be a neat place for him to be because it has a plant community type called a Central Appalachian Shale Barren. And they are very common here in the Massanuttons. To do our due diligence, we wanted to see what other people had done in the past in the shale barrens in these regions, just to give us a sense of what we might find there. And this is where we first encounter a paper by Lena Artz. And I remembered her. Oh, I've seen her in the Flora of Virginia. And I'll just read this since it's a little bit small there. It says, Plants of the Shale Banks of the Massanutten Mountains of Virginia by Lena Artz, Arlington, Virginia. And this paper was published in 1937, so rather old. But it caught my eye because she uses Arlington, Virginia, which is really close to Fairfax. I was like, what was she doing in Fairfax? Where was she employed? Why was she writing this paper in 1937, which is pretty unusual for a woman to be doing at that period of time in Virginia. And then I noted down at the bottom, it says it was part of a thesis submitted to the faculty at George Washington University, in part satisfaction of the requirements for a degree of Masters of Arts. So this was a graduate project. And I was really interested to learn more about her. I realized, she must have a body of work. Let's learn about her. Maybe we'll find more information about the shale banks. But I got frustrated because Googling her, which you do, I found the beginning and the end. I found a picture of her seated on her mother's lap. She's a toddler here. She's probably about 2 years old, probably about 1893. And I found a picture of her gravestone. And this told me information in terms of where she was buried. But I found no obituary. I just didn't find a paper trail about who she was. And so I put on my researcher hat and I did what I knew how to do, which was look for more scientific papers. And I uncovered 42 of them that she had written about the Virginia flora from 1917 until 1974. That is a really long time to be writing scientific papers. She discovered a new plant species, and this picture here shows you a species known as smokehole bergamot, and it is very rare in West Virginia, and at this point in time, it's presumed extirpated in this state. So, new species. And she was also elected an honorary lifetime member of the Virginia Academy of Sciences shortly before she died. And so, she was clearly very important, but who was she? How did she get trained? What did she do for a job? Why didn't we know more? And then, kismet, I discovered that the Lord Fairfax Community College had 2 boxes of her personal papers. that had been donated to them in the mid-1970s. And I found out this several years after I brought the herbarium specimens to Mason. And once sort of the pandemic sort of got to the point where you could go other places and pick things up, I was able to get a hold of these materials in the January of 2022. And that's when I realized that I was going to be the person to write her biography and to tell people who she was. I have done that. So I wrote what should have been written when she passed away, which is sort of your standard scientific memoriam. What did she do? Where was she trained? And I have copies of the paper that will be available in the break room, but also a QR code if you just want the free PDF. And so I just want to talk to you about a little bit of the research I did to piece together where she was on the landscape. She did devote her life to the Massanuttons. I tried to find every single herbarium specimen that she created in her life. She created over 2,000 of them, and over 90% of them are from the Massanuttons. And so you can see this county-level map of Virginia. She traveled widely in the state, but she chose only to make specimens from the Massanuttons. At this point, her specimens are scattered around the world. There is a specimen in China, there's a specimen in Sweden, there's a bunch at Harvard, there's plenty at Virginia Tech, in 21 different institutions around the world. The really key thing for piecing together her biography were her herbarium specimens, because the labels are essentially signed, dated slips of paper that tell me exactly when and where she was on the landscape. And so this is just an image of one of those labels, and it is washed out. And it says she was collecting this walking fern from Raleigh Springs in Virginia, from Shady Cliffs, and she was there on September 16th, 2027. So nearly 100 years ago. So she was there. And I also have her collecting notebooks. And so this has been a historical goldmine, but I also want to point out, in telling her story over the last couple of years, I've encountered these resources for history in this area that are really astounding. And local memory of her remains strong, as we just heard at the beginning, like, oh, my grandmother knew her, or I have something of hers in my home, let me show it to you. So this has been a really neat part of this project. So the reason why she studied the Massanuttons was because she was from this area. She was born and raised in Shenandoah County. She was raised on her family's farm, which is on, today it's known as Artz Road. So if you go up Route 11, you will actually see a turnoff called Artz Road. And that is where her extended family lived and still live today. She's part of a very large extended family that has been in the area for a very long period of time. She spent her early adulthood in the Port Republic, McGaheysville area. She left the area for a period of time and then retired to a cabin that she built probably as a graduation present to herself for getting her master's degree, but near Elizabeth Furnace. And that is actually the cabin portrayed in the Flora, Virginia. And that is her leaning up against her wood pile. She heated her home with wood until she was in her late 60s, when she caved and bought herself an oil burner. One of the early coups that I had was just looking at old maps. And this is a wonderful map from 1885. It shows you that squiggle is the North Fork. And lo and behold, there is the name of her father. This is the homestead, the J.P. Artz homestead. That was her father. And that helped me exactly put her on the map. This is where she grew up. I subsequently have found some other wonderful resources associated with the Shenandoah County Library, and that is their extensive photograph collection. This is a picture of Lena Artz that I found just a few months ago. She's 11 years old in this image. Her older brother was a school teacher. She was from a line of school teachers. Her brother was significantly older than she was and was a school teacher here. And she became a school teacher. She graduated from high school at the age of 21, which has probably some reasons why she graduated so late, but she graduated with a teaching certificate, which is what you could do back then. And she immediately started teaching elementary school, then shifted to teach high school biology. And she was in the Virginia public school retirement system very early on, and she taught, and she earned a pension, and she retired in 1947. So she was an educator, and she was always an educator for her entire life. But she was also very interested in botany. And I don't know how, but she was probably self-taught initially. At this period of time, it was very common for science to be taught as nature study in classes. And you can still buy these manuals today, also, they're still in print. This was thought as a really excellent way to train students to follow a protocol and learn about the natural world. So collecting butterflies, pinning insects, collecting bird nests, learning how to identify wildflowers. This was how you learned as a child in school. She probably learned it that way, and she also probably taught her students that way as well. And I found one of these manuals in her papers. I also found an article that she wrote into one of these popular science nature study magazines in 1917, really sort of the first inkling that she's sort of reaching out, asking questions. And then she takes one of the first big leaps that sort of astounds me. She sends herself to college. She goes to William and Mary in her early 30s. Just as a little reminder, William and Mary didn't accept women until 1920. And so about 4 or 5 years after that, she goes as an undergraduate. She had gone to University of Virginia during the summer for normal school training, like professional development classes. Here she is seated in a student group photo. And she was at school at a really important time, at least in the history of science for Virginia. The Virginia Academy of Science incorporated in 1923. And in 1926, a group of botanists in the state got together and said, we need a flora for this state. And we need to start talking to each other about doing very close observations and comparing notes. And so the Flora Committee got started in 1926. Now, the Flora of Virginia that I've been passing around, it wasn't published until 2012. So it was a lot slower than they had intended. But the specimens that botanists were creating in the 20s and the 30s are still around. They're in cabinets, and they are useful to researchers today. So much of the knowledge that went into making the Flora of Virginia comes from this generation of people, and in the 40s and in the 50s and the 60s, but it really gets started here. And she was inspired by this, and I know this because she returned home to the Port Republic, McGahkeysville area, and she immediately started making beautiful herbarium specimens. And I know that she was serious about this because she started numbering her collections. So this is a zoom in on one of the labels of one of her specimens. And she's very careful. She does all the things that you're supposed to do. The date is included, July 29th, 1929. A pretty good locality, like you could go back and find it if you needed to. And its scientific identification. And she was collecting in triplicate and doing all the things that professional botanists do. She takes the next big leap. She leaves the Shenandoah Valley for the rest of her professional career. She takes a job in Northern Virginia. And she accepts a job at Washington and Lee High School in Arlington, which is now known as Liberty High School. And I suspect it was a new high school at that period of time. I think she was probably very competitive for the job. She had a bachelor degree, which is not all women had that back then who were school teachers. She had at least 10 years under her belt, and she had won some accolades as a teacher here. And so she made the leap, and soon after going to Northern Virginia, she joins the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club. And this is her. I found this wonderful lantern slide in the the archives in Vienna last December. The lantern slide is about this big, but I've circled her there. She's there in the front in hiking gear. She has a very distinctive haircut. She's easy to spot. And the hiking clubs, hiking was a new sport back then. The Appalachian Trail was new. And these hiking clubs were very egalitarian mixes of people from Washington, D.C. There were Ph.D. geologists. There were clerks in the War Office. It was just a really interesting mix of people. And I think this group of people may have pointed her in the direction of where to get graduate education at George Washington University. Although she was living and working in Arlington, she was returning to the Massanuttons frequently. All her family was here. She spent her summer vacations here, school holidays, she came back, and she continued to collect. So she never really left the area. Her heart was always here. This is another fabulous photo that I found. Here she is circled in orange. Again, these hikes were these big social affairs. They would publish newspaper articles about their weekend hikes because it was so difficult, so they would charter a bus. This is a hike on the section of the AT called the roller coaster that goes from Snickers Gap up to Harper's Ferry, and that's what that plaque says in the man's hands. She does go to graduate school. She goes to George Washington, and she chooses as her topic the plants of the shale banks of the Massanutten Mountains. This is another photograph in the newspaper about one of these expeditions. In this case, they're going up to the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. And this is the first evidence that I see that she is interacting with this man in the tie, who is her thesis advisor, Dr. Robert Griggs, who was an ecologist and wound up being a lifelong friend. He was a really wonderful advisor for her. This is her in the field. This is really her happy place. Her advisor mentions in his memoir that she was a woman of the mountains. She was happiest here, particularly in the Massanuttons. She knew the area like the back of her hand. She knew the people. She would just essentially just dead reckon her way across the mountains, as far as I can tell from her collecting notebooks, because she knew everyone. She just trespassed on everybody's land, but explored the mountains. And she was going from shale baron to shale baron to record the species that she found there, and also to collect and make specimens. And so this gem of an image that I found last month shows her with a hank of plants in her hand, and she has a vasculum, which is sort of this metal canister hanging off of her shoulder where you put the plants so they don't wilt. And I'm pretty sure this is the specimen that she made from those plants that she has in her hand. This is a phenomenal photograph. I was so excited to find it. And this is because last month, as a consequence of giving a talk at Fort Valley Museum, someone in the public realized that they had purchased at an antiques auction years previously a scrapbook. They didn't know who this person was. They just knew it was filled with a lot of interesting pictures and personal letters, and they purchased it and they saved it. And then they saw Lena Artz's name either on Facebook or in a local newspaper and said, oh. And they found it in their attic or whatever, and they donated it to the museum. And so it's these types of discoveries that keep me going and give me confidence that there's more out there, that people have stories to share, photographs that maybe their grandmother took, right? That Lena's in the background, she's doing something. She's that anonymous person in the background. She was out and about. So she becomes an expert on the Massanutten flora, and she's doing this while she's working full-time as a high school biology teacher. And I just want to list the ways in which the work she did was important. She was the first person to explore all the shale barrens in this region. And by creating these checklists, it allowed them to be compared with what is more common in West Virginia and other areas with shale barrens. So it allowed comparison between these areas. She was also the first one to document that a lot of these plant species in these really harsh environments, and let me just back up here for a second. This image I'm showing you here, it looks like a scree slope of like rock pebbles, and it's on a very steep slope. That's a shale barren. no soil, very hot and dry, very steep, very harsh environments for plants to grow. But there are endemic plants there, like this shale barren buckwheat, which is actually very common in Edinburg Gap, if you know where to look. These species thrive because they have really deep roots, and she was the first one to take a pickaxe and very carefully excavate these plants to understand that they survive by creating these very deep roots. And so this image that she included in her thesis is for those herbarium specimen papers, a little teeny plant, and then the roots, which are many, many feet long, glued onto that piece of paper to give you a sense of perspective. So novel discoveries. An important thing that she did as well is her horizons expanded. And she started meeting people from all over the world who were working in the Smithsonian or collaborating with her advisor. And she also had she was a beautiful letter writer. She had excellent penmanship, thankfully. And she had a very wide network of correspondence at Harvard, other places. So she got a second career. It launched her career as a botanist, and she was doing this at midlife. And shortly after graduating, she's presenting at national meetings. I found this wonderful image of her when I went to Mountain Lake Biological Station and I looked through their photo archive. This is a really historic meeting of botanists from all over the country, including some really well-known botanists like the Browns and Fernald from Harvard and Edgar Wary from University of Pennsylvania, really famous people. And there she is, right on the far left side, wearing jodhpurs, is Lena Artz. And so she was in the mix. She knew these very famous people. But I will point out that she was different because she was a high school biology teacher. She wasn't a professor like all these other people were. She wasn't a man, right? So she was different. And that had consequences later on in her life. So George Washington launched her career. She retired at the age of 55, and she moved to her cabin in Fort Valley. And she lived there for the next 34 years of her life. And she was able to retire at 55 because she began teaching so young, and she was paying into the pension system. Virginia was one of the country's leaders in offering pensions like this to their teachers. And this gave her financial independence. She never married, never had children, and so she was it. She had to support herself. She got a second career. She retired, and immediately, based on her letters, she was devoting herself in sort of, to paraphrase what she was telling curators at Harvard, I want to do right by this little corner of the world that I call home and love, and that she loves. So she dedicated herself to documenting the Massanuttons. She was really the person who was the right person at the right time to do this job. She was working at a time where white-tailed deer weren't a problem. They were nearly hunted to extirpation in this region in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, and they were reintroduced. And as we all know, white-tailed deer eat a lot of things, particularly when they're at high densities. That was not the case in the 20s and 30s. So she was seeing a lot more than what we can see today because it has been removed by white-tailed deer, but other things as well. A lot of land use change has gone on since she was active collecting, so draining of wetlands, the use of broad-scale herbicides along the roadsides, invasive plants that sort of smother things along the roadside. That was not the case in the 20s and 30s. So her specimens have time value for giving us a snapshot of what the Massanuttons look like in the early, mid-20th century. She was the person there, living there, doing this recording. She published about half her papers while she was retired. She wrote her last paper in her 80s. She also was a people person. She had a very wide network of friends and correspondents. Neighbors visited her. She just had a very active social life. And she was also very generous with her time in giving talks to local area garden clubs, bird clubs, the Isaac Walton League. She became very interested in the perils of DDT. She was an avid bird watcher. She was very concerned about plans of damming, like the Potomac River, and putting dams in the Shenandoah River that did not come to pass because of people like her saying, the area is beautiful as it is. We don't need another lake for recreation. We have plenty of recreation around us. She also hosted and guided botanists who were coming into the Smithsonian, German botanists, the botanists from California, botanists from Wyoming. They would come to do work at the Smithsonian, but then resident botanists would come out for the weekend and they would stay at her cabin, and she would take them on guided tours in the mountains. So because place is so important to her story, I wanted to relocate her cabin because she wrote half of her papers there. It essentially was a field station for her. From about 1935, she bought it months after she got her master's degree. And it was, I think, probably a 3-season cabin when she built it, and she used it as a vacation home while she was still working in Arlington. But when she moved there full-time in 1947, she converted it to like a 4-season full, wintertime house. And it is still there. I spent several hours in the courthouse looking at records to figure out where it would be. And it is someone's cherished vacation home. There is landscaping. They allowed me to look around at the landscaping. Based on her notes that she left behind, there is a lot that is still there that she planted. And this is 60, 80 years after she had been on that land. So there's still absolutely the footprint of Lena still around that property, which was exciting to see. We know about Lena because of this man. His name is Marlin Krause. He passed away in 2001, so the memories of him are still quite fresh. At least I've encountered a number of people who knew him. He lived in Fort Valley. He was her neighbor and her friend who was also really excited about birding and botany. And when Lena advanced in years, and I think her mobility started to decrease, he was her field companion. And when she passed away, he was the one who gathered her papers from her desk drawers, dumped them in boxes, and took them to Lord Fairfax Community College because he knew the curator, Robert Simpson, and knew that this often happens with scientists. Their papers get archived at universities where they can be studied. And so I just want to address some things that are often asked. Why was she such a mystery? Why didn't we know more about her? And I think this is a really interesting question, and I've thought a lot about it. The first one is just simple life history. She never married. She never had children to keep her memory alive in that way. She was never employed by a research institution, so she didn't have academic children, graduate students, who could maybe write that obituary or the memoriam. And by the time she passed away in her mid-80s. Many of her friends and colleagues had already passed away. And then there was, I think, some bad luck, happenstance, as just things happen. Her earliest collections were never distributed from the institution that she deposited them. Typically, you collect in triplicate. You make 3 of everything, and that institution sends out those 2 other copies to other museums so people can look at them. They never left Virginia Military Institute. They just stayed there. She published her earliest papers in a journal called Claytonia, which folded in the late 30s and unbelievably remains unindexed today. The Library of the State of Virginia, if you're listening, please digitize it. It's filled with really important papers about new species descriptions, and so these are things that maybe people didn't see. So bad luck. People just didn't learn her name. And just happenstance, her papers were donated in the mid-1970s, but they weren't looked at until 2022. So that's just the passage of time, the sands of time sort of accumulate. And then I also have to note there was exclusion by others. As I noted, she was always sort of on the edge. She wasn't part of sort of the political mix of sort of the academic botanists or the museum botanists. And there was one thing that I had noted in reading lots of papers related to shale barrens, and she was an expert on shale barrens. She published some of the earliest papers, that people in the 50s and the 60s were citing facts that she discovered, but were not citing her papers, which is bad form. And so I was sort of puzzled about this, and I sort of worked my way back, and I discovered a paper that was published in 1946 by two individuals, Allard and Leonard, and they write without valid justification that her observations could be discounted. It's a strange outsized criticism, and I think it had a chilling effect, that he was a very famous person, or more well-known, and that when people sat down later to write about these areas, they played it safe and cited him. This was not just my interpretation. I found a note in her papers on the back side of one of these offending papers that cited her facts but did not cite her. She says, my contributions: 1, extended the ranges of endemic plants. 2, reported them from other shales other than the Brailier shales, which are in West Virginia, and reported root-to-shoot relations, the first to do this. So give me credit, please, for this little bit. It sort of broke my heart when I read that, but I was also heartened because she was not oblivious to where she stood in the world, and she knew what was going on. So I want to sort of take a more positive spin on this, and that is Lena leaves behind a legacy that matters today. As I said before, the time value of her specimens record plant populations that we haven't seen in decades. And this gives us a snapshot of what the environment looked like 100 years ago. So maybe as a target for restoration, how we might want to improve things to bring back more of what she saw in the past. She was the first to demonstrate that this gorgeous orchid, the northern showy lady slipper, calls the Massanuttons home. She was also the first to discover black ash up in the higher elevation areas like Peters Mill Bog and Mudhole Bog. A lot of sort of what we call northern disjuncts, things that are more common in New England that just barely get down in Virginia on the tops of mountains. And there's continued discovery from her work and illumination of other historical botanists. So she had a wide range of correspondence and collaborators, and by learning more about her, I'm learning more about them. And these people also are not well known. So I want to give you 2 examples to finish up my talk today. So 2 stories, quick. One is about this pretty pink flowered thing called Ozark milkvetch, and the other is this man, Francis Wells Hunnewell II, who was a contemporary of Lena's. He was born in 1880 and he passed away in 1964. So these 2 stories come together at the end. These are linked, and they're linked through Lena. So, looking through Lena's old field notebooks, I noted that she talked a lot about this species, Ozark milkvetch. And I knew, based on what the Natural Heritage Program tracks, this was presumed extirpated in the state of Virginia. It hadn't been seen for decades and decades. Locally extinct. It happens all the time. And it was known to live in Maryland, and it was known to be living in West Virginia, but these old collections hadn't been seen in decades. So I thought, why don't we just go back to some of Lena's old field sites and just look? And so we went up to the knob. So this is a little map looking at the water tower of Mount Jackson, the one with apples on it. Everybody knows that one. And then you look to the east and you see the crest of Short Mountain and then the southern terminus, which is this rocky cliff bit. And the gigantic scree slope underneath that is a massive shale barren. So we hiked up there, natural heritage botanists and myself, and we found it. Really healthy populations of it, which is really exciting, which has set off a quest. Lena also noted it that it was very common along the roadsides in Fort Valley, around the Dietrich area. Acres of it, she said, even as late as the 1960s. And so I drove every road in that fort last summer, looking out of my car window, and I found it in an old power line right away. And I got inspired and I put up a wanted sign at the gas station / sandwich shop. And 3 weeks later, a landowner called me and said, I have it on my property. Would you like to come and look at it? And so we found 2 more populations in Fort Valley. Really fun. And this, of course, is now the basis of the master's degree project of one of my students, Emily Poindexter. Ozark milkvetch has a very funny distribution. It's found in the mid-Atlantic, and then it's found very widely in the Ozarks and in the south central part of this country. And that type of distribution for plants is often the indicator that maybe you're dealing actually with 2 species, not just one. So we're testing that using genetics. As part of this, we looked for all the herbarium specimens ever made of Ozark milkvetch in Virginia, these really old historical populations. And a number of them popped out. And this one was collected by a man named F.W. Hunnewell, and this specimen is held in Harvard, and it was collected near 7 fountains. And it was from 1939. This is walking distance from Lena's house. And this is when she was living there. And so I was like, well, did he know Lena? And also, what was a Harvard botanist doing in Fort Valley? It's not a place you stumble into. You got to know where you're going to get there. And so I was very curious, and I did a little sleuthing. And I realized that he was the last private owner of Belle Grove plantation. And that's why he was in the area. It's like 5 miles away. He was probably on a Sunday drive. But if he was an academic botanist, I don't know any other academic botanist that has the funds to buy an estate hundreds of miles away from their area, from their place of employment. And so I was very curious about who this person was. He was not a botanist by training. He was an attorney, and he was, for a large part of his career, the comptroller of Harvard. He was from a family with long philanthropic ties with Harvard, and also a family avocation of botany. His grandfather created new cultivars of azaleas from his estate in Wells. So he was a student at Harvard, he trained, he got his J.D. from Harvard, but he always was interested in botany. And so when he joined Harvard as an employee in the upper administration, he also joined the New England Botanical Club, which held its specimens at Harvard. And so this is an old image of one of the old rooms in Harvard with lots of herbarium cabinets and specimens. And the way that he interacted with this club is that he collected plants, just like Lena did, and then gave them to Harvard to deposit as part of their research collection. I did a little sleuthing, and just to see, I found like 12,000 of his herbarium specimens that he created over the course of his life, and I discovered he was an enormously well-traveled person. He collected in Fiji, New Zealand, Guatemala. He went to Brazil multiple times, and this is in the 30s and 40s, when getting to these places was an event. And this brings up 2 things in my mind. By the time he purchased Belle Grove in 1929, he was a very good botanist, very well experienced, and he also had the means to purchase a home anywhere in the world. Why did he choose Virginia? He had no family here. He was not married. I see no ties with this state at all, yet he buys Belle Grove and he uses it as an extended vacation home for the rest of his life. He comes down for weeks or months at a time, multiple times throughout the year. And I think he fell in love with Virginia because of its plants. He took a lot of vacations. He traveled extensively. And he went to Luray on a vacation. And he went there a couple years, and I don't think he spent a long time in the caves. I think he was outside because he made a lot of herbarium specimens, and he was here during April, which is the best month to be a botanist in Virginia because everything is blooming. And this is when he starts becoming a very serious collector. He starts numbering his collections, just like Lena did. He goes to another resort. He goes to Hot Springs in Bath County. And this place is really well known by botanists for being a great place to go botanizing because they have a lot of shale barrens. So it's coming together. The story is coming together, linked together by shale barrens. And so he was out on these barrens, which are these really steep, hot cliff faces, not the luxurious hot springs that we think of, but out there exploring. And I think I've found the day where he was sold on the state of Virginia as a place to live, and that is May 11th, 1916. He finds a new species on this shale barren. It's a species of leather flower. He comes back the next year to collect the same population, but when it's fruiting, to sort of get the full picture. He also finds a state record in Bath County when he's out there on the barrens. He finds the first record of Kate's mountain clover, which is found in the Massanuttons as well. And it inspires him to write his first paper about the Virginia flora, and he publishes it in 1923. World War I intervenes. He's stationed in Washington, D.C. in some capacity. He collects in the Alexandria, Great Falls regions, but he publishes a paper about Virginia. He's still living in Boston. He's still working at Harvard. But as you know, Belgrove was run as an inn, a hotel, and he stayed there as a guest for I don't know how many years, but my understanding is multiple years. And in 1929, he purchases it. And within months, he finds a new state record. And this is the state record of Ozark milkvetch. So that same pink flowered thing that Lena talked a lot about, he was the first one to find it in the state of Virginia, and he finds it on his property. So that is why he was in Fort Valley. His mind was already cued to find this thing. He knew what it looked like. And that often sort of predisposes you to finding it again when your brain remembers what it looks like. He was a very quiet person. This is him sitting in his study in Belgrove. As I said, he never married, never had children. And I didn't know much about him, but I did stumble across a video by Kristen Lays that she had posted to YouTube about him. And what caught my attention was that she noted that he kept a daily diary when he was in residence. The weather, what he ate, who visited, just really short stuff. And she had it transcribed. So I just sent her a cold email and said, "Hi, would you do a keyword search? Look for Lena Artz." And lo and behold, there are multiple entries in his diary about Lena Artz. And I know it's tiny, but there are multiple years. It goes from 1949 through 1959. He passes away in 1964. But the amusing thing about these entries is half the time he goes to her house and she is not at home because she's collecting, she's hiking. She did have a phone, he had a phone, but I think back then you just dropped in on your neighbors like a Sunday call. But he does, so the first entry is him just trying to find her house. So this is the first time he visits her at home. And then the part that I have highlighted here is a little adventure that they took together. So in 1951, he writes, "It was a maximum of 88 degrees, up at 5:30, breakfast at 6:15, left house at 7:15, met Lena Artz at her house at 8, drove to Ruckles Gap, walked from 10:30 to 3:30 p.m., then lunched and returned home at 6:30 p.m., having motored 130 miles and walked for 5 hours. These folks were in their late 60s and early 70s, so just to give you a sense, and Ruckles Gap is steep depending on where you want to go. This is sort of 3/4 of the way down to McGaheysville along the South Fork. It was a favorite haunt of hers when she was in her 20s, when she was living in that area. So she probably drove. She loved driving. She had a Volkswagen. She loved to explore. So I imagine he folded up his frame into her tiny car and they bumped down the roads. And she took him for an epic hike. And she was an epic hiker. She never sat still. And so this just shows you sort of the timeline. He drove down to Belle Grove to her little cabin. They drove all the way down to Ruckles Gap. And because Hunnewell collected during that day, we know what they saw. And so these are just two examples. They saw a neat orchid. They saw a really pretty blazing star. And that was just fun to sort of draw these stories, to connect all the dots, to track them where they were on the landscape. Her boxes of papers have taken me years to understand what they actually mean. And knowing that Hunnewell and Artz had this friendship explains something that she did that was strange, at least for her. And that was she came out of the mountains and she followed Cedar Creek for its entire length, and she collected on the banks. It's like 50 miles, and she did it in segments, and she has little booklets where she writes the lists of everything that she sees on her segment hikes. And I never could understand why she did this. She stayed in the mountains. And I'm certain it was because she knew Hunnewell, and Belle Grove Plantation has a lot of riverfront. So I think they were talking, and he was expressing excitement about the flora, and it is an interesting flora along Cedar Creek because it goes through limestone, and that she probably parked her car on his property and sort of walked that way. So it shows this connection, and it explains what she did. And she even writes in the back of this booklet some social obligations that she had. I'm sure, as we all do, like just trying to like organize our busy lives, like, okay, where am I going to be? And she says May 10th, Belle Grove. May 13th, she's going to the Virginia Academy of Sciences meeting. So she was going to his house. So I want to wrap up just by saying that the story of Lena Artz continues. There are many things that I want to learn about her life. But what I'm finding is that living people today, have memories of Lena. And their memories are really interesting and deserve to be recorded because it fleshes out who she was. And so I've started an oral history project. I have 2 people that I'm trying to encourage to sit down with me so I can ask them about their memories. And the memories would probably be from the 1950s or the 70s when she was retired and an elderly woman. And the individuals would have been, early teens, young adults at that period of time. She was out there, and she left a big written record that I've been able to discover through all sorts of means. But she was a very social person. She taught summer camp at Elizabeth Furnace, which was a place for a lot of 4-H'ers and Girl Scouts to go. She would do the nature walks. I've been told that she also taught at Nature Camp, which is in Nelson County. She was a member of Strasburg Christian Church. And for about 4 or 5 years in the late 1950s, early 1960s, she was a matron at the Winchester Memorial Hospital Training School for Nurses. And so she was like the dorm mother. So she clearly interacted with a lot of people who, yes, they may be retired and elderly today, but they may have memories of what she was like as a person. So please pass the word. Even if you have memories of your grandmother meeting her, I would like to know, because I have more than a decade of her daily diaries from when she was in her 60s and 70s, and she mentions everyone under the sun, and I have no idea who these people are. So in many cases, as I meet people in town, I remember your last name, and then I go back and I see she's mentioning these names again, like the Orndorffs and the Hoddles, and everyone's in this area. So there's a lot of connection that still remains between this area and Lena. She is buried in the historic Massanutten graveyard behind the Military Academy in Woodstock. It's a beautiful area. She's buried next to her sisters and her parents. None of her other sisters married either. Her 2 older brothers did have children and do have descendants today in the area. And so I've been fortunate to connect with her first cousin twice removed, who was an Artz by birth, and to get a sense of the family history as well. So I think with that, I want to thank you. It's been really fun talking to you all. I'm excited to hear if you have questions or comments. Again, the copies of the biography are in the break room or the refreshments room, along with this QR code if you would like to get a PDF onto your phone. Thank you.
If anybody has questions, please ask. We all want to know the answers.
You can search for Frances Hoover in the contacts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So remind me again the relationship.
All I know is that Miss Hoover knew her.
Okay.
She was a third grade teacher at Strasburg. She was really interested in plants and bird watching and everything.
Okay, I'm going to write this
So
down.
I'm sure they had some contacts.
Frances Hoover, and she was an educator, third grade, at Strasburg Elementary. Plants.
And Barbara probably had plants around her house that Miss Hoover had collected.
Yeah, things that she planted for sure.
Yeah.
Lena had sticky fingers when it came to scooping up wildflowers and transplanting them to her house. So when I visited last summer, there's a lot of interesting species in the yard. She, in her daily diaries, she took so much joy out of gardening and birding. And she mentions, what she planted and what was growing. And I remember she wrote that she was really excited to find a little Rose Bay rhododendron seedling growing in her backyard. There are none around, at least in her area. And when I went there it is, a beautiful, massive shrub. And that, I'm certain that was the plant that she referenced. So there's a lot of little footsteps that she's left behind. Yeah.
When you came to County Heritage Day, that was in your presentation there, the revelation to me, even though I had moved to this area in 1978, you indicated that you might be considering, in addition to all your extensive scientific dimension here, a biography. Is that a fair question?
Oh yeah. No, I mean, and this is a really long-term. I'm not a historian by training or anything, and one thing that I've learned is that this is not a linear. The progress is not linear. It goes in fits and starts and like these amazing revelations, and then you find the connections and you find another rabbit hole to go down, and that continues with Lena. But what I'm really also excited is to understand her place in time. So I think she was pioneering in many respects. She had her own career. She sent herself to college. She had the wherewithal to understand that she was the right person at the right time to be doing what she did. No one told her that. They were not telling her that, right? She was sort of on the edge, and she knew that the Massanuttons were really an important place. So how do you put that in context in the larger sort of world of her place and time in Virginia in the mid-20th century? I'm also really excited to learn more about the environmental history of the mountains, because she was there at a period of a lot of transition in terms of, to say nothing of sort of the social and political changes that occurred over her lifetime. It sort of boggles my mind that she grew up being driven by horses, and at the end of her life, she was driving a VW Bug. It boggles my mind that she got the right to vote when she was in her mid-20s. I mean, really amazing time points. Most of her professional career was bracketed between the two great wars. She survived the Great Depression. I mean, she lived through so much political and social change and environmental change. And so I really would like to learn more about how the mountains have changed. And that's also one question that I'm really excited to ask anyone who wants to sit down with me is, what was it like in the fort in the 1920s and 30s? Even Lena's notes from the 60s, it snowed a lot more. Really amazing how cold it was. Just her descriptions of, ice on the windows and being snowed in for a long period of time. Really a neat neat memories that deserve to be recorded and shared, and to say nothing of all the images that people might have in their family photos about hillsides and what the landscape looked like.
If no one else is ready to, I'd like to buy another question. In addition to the books, it's not my profession, this sounds to me to make all things
It is fascinating.
Part two, is there a prospect of any institution or group of institutions establishing something somewhere, the cabinet/museum visitor center, or is that going to be your herbarium that's going to do that?
It would be wonderful to have a display at Fort Valley Museum about her, because she has donated. That museum was really the place where I found her relative. I stumbled into the museum because I knew Lena couldn't resist being part of that museum because she was an educator, even though she was very elderly at that point. But I'm like, oh, she was just down the road. I bet she donated something to that museum, and she did. And so I was talking with the docents there, and one of them said, you should talk to my friend. She's an arts. And that's how I found her first cousin twice removed, and that helped me understand a lot. And yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, please join all of us back here for refreshments.
Yeah.
And Andrea will continue to answer questions, ask questions.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.